Let's look at the arc of consequences. 1979, Soviet invasion, American covert response begins. 1989, Soviet withdrawal, America abandons Afghanistan. 1996, Taliban take over, al-Qaeda sanctuary established. 2001, the September 11th attacks, America invades Afghanistan. 2021, American withdrawal, Taliban returns to power. The wheel has turned full circle. The war that began in 1979 has never truly ended. The country that America used as a Cold War battlefield, abandoned, invaded, occupied for 20 years, and abandoned again, remains in the hands of the forces America once armed. The cost defies calculation. Afghan dead since 1979, over 1 million, perhaps 2 million. American dead on September 11th, 2,977. American dead in the Afghan war that followed, 2,461. American dead on the broader war on terror, thousands more. Trillions of dollars spent on wars that achieved no lasting outcome. Constitutional freedoms curtailed in the name of security, surveillance expanded, due process weakened, executive power enlarged, and the Taliban rules Afghanistan again.
Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
In 1998, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who had served as national security advisor under President Carter, gave an interview to a French newspaper. He was asked about the American covert operation in Afghanistan during the 1980s, which had armed Islamic fighters against the Soviet Union. The interviewer noted that these fighters had become a problem. Some had turned to terrorism. The Taliban had taken over Afghanistan. Was this a concern? Brzezinski's response: what is more important in world history, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? Some agitated Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War? Some agitated Muslims. 3 years after that interviewer, those agitated Muslims killed nearly 3,000 Americans in a single September morning. The networks that planned the attacks were built during the Afghan operation Brzezinski championed. The ideology that motivated the attackers was jihadism, that America had promoted as a weapon against the Soviets. The sanctuary from which they operated was in a country America had armed, used, and abandoned. This episode examines the largest CIA covert operation since Vietnam, the Afghan Jihad against Soviet occupation. It succeeded brilliantly in its immediate objective. The Soviets withdrew, humiliated, and it failed catastrophically in its long-term consequences. The networks, weapons, and the ideology we funded created the Taliban and al-Qaeda. The September 11th attacks were not random. They were not inexplicable. They were blowback. The unintended consequences of covert action, blowing back on the country that had conducted it. The term blowback was invented by the CIA itself. Chalmers Johnson, the scholar who popularized it, wrote a book with that title in the year 2000, before September 11th. He warned that American interventions were generating hostility that would eventually manifest in attacks on American targets. He identified the Afghan operation as the paradigm case. He was ignored. Then he was proven right. Understanding this history is not academic. The pattern continues. The institutional capacity for such operations remains. The assumptions that produce the Afghan disaster persist. The founders warned against foreign entanglements. Afghanistan proves why. I am Jeff Gellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is episode 12 of the series, Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements, from the Founders to the Forever Wars. Today, Charlie Wilson's Blowback, Afghanistan, and the creation of al-Qaeda. This episode begins part 5 of our series, The War on Terror and its Origins, where part 4 examined the covert operations of the Cold War. Part 5 traces how those operations generated the threats that would justify a new era of intervention and surveillance. This episode corresponds to Article 12 of our written series, and given the scope of the material from the Soviet invasion through September 11th, this will be a more detailed episode than we could write in that article. Let us begin with an invasion that changed the world. On December 24th, 1979, Christmas Eve, Soviet forces crossed into Afghanistan. The intervention would last nearly a decade, kill over 1 million Afghans, and contribute to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. It would also set in motion a series of consequences that continue to this day. Afghanistan had been a constitutional monarchy until 1973, when a coup established a republic. In 1978, a communist faction seized power. The new government pursued radical reforms that provoked fierce resistance from traditional and religious elements. By 1979, the communist government was losing control. Insurgency spread across the countryside. The Soviets faced a choice: let their client state collapse or intervene to save it. They chose intervention. Over 100,000 Soviet troops would eventually deploy. They expected a brief operation to stabilize the government, but they would remain for nearly a decade and leave in defeat. President Jimmy Carter responded with symbolic measures and covert action. He announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. The United States also boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics. But more significantly, Carter authorized the CIA to supply the Afghan resistance. The operation began small, a few $1 million in non-lethal aid. But National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski saw larger possibilities. He wanted to give the Soviets their Vietnam, to draw them into a quagmire that would bleed their military, drain their economy, and hasten their decline. Brzezinski later claimed the American covert support had actually begun before the Soviet invasion, that the goal was to provoke Soviet intervention, not merely respond to it. Now, whether or not this is accurate, the strategic vision is clear. Afghanistan would be a trap, and Afghan blood would be the bait. The Afghan people were the instruments for American strategic objectives, and what happened to them afterward was not America's concern. Enter Charlie Wilson, a Democratic congressman from the 2nd District of Texas. Wilson was a colorful figure, hard-drinking, flamboyant, known for attractive female staff members he called Charlie's Angels. He was an unlikely candidate to direct the largest covert operation since Vietnam. But Wilson had visited Afghan refugee camps in Pakistan in 1982 and was moved by what he saw. He returned convinced that the Mujahideen, the Islamic figures resisting Soviet occupation, deserved serious American support. His position on the House Defense Appropriations Subcommittee gave him unusual leverage over intelligence budgets, and he began using that leverage to funnel money to the Afghan operation, often adding funds beyond what the CIA requested. And at the CIA, the Afghan operation was run by Gus Avercotos, a working-class case officer who had clashed with the agency's establishment. Wilson and Avercotos formed an unlikely alliance that would transform American involvement. The budget? The budget grew exponentially. $5 million in 1980, $20 million in 1983, $250 million in 1985, and over $500 million by 1987. Saudi Arabia matched American contributions dollar for dollar, effectively doubling the resources. By the mid-1980s, the Afghan operation was the largest covert action program in CIA history. Pakistan. Pakistan was the essential partner. Afghanistan was landlocked. Weapons had to flow through Pakistani territory. The Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, the ISI, controlled distribution. This gave Pakistan enormous influence. And the ISI had its own agenda. Pakistani intelligence favored the most extreme Islamist factions among the Mujahideen, groups that would be reliable Pakistani clients after the war ended. The United States knew this. American officials knew that aid was flowing to extremists. They did not effectively object. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar exemplified the problem. A virulent Islamist with a reputation for brutality. Hekmatyar had thrown acid in the faces of unveiled women at Kabul University. His forces killed more rival Mujahideen than the Soviets. He would later ally with the Taliban and support attacks on American forces. Hekmatyar received more American aid than any other Mujahideen commander. Not because the CIA chose him, but because the ISI did. America provided the weapons. Pakistan decided who got them. And Pakistan chose extremists. The pattern would repeat. American resources flowing through partners with different agendas, producing consequences America did not intend and could not control. The Afghan operation succeeded because it provided the Mujahideen with weapons that changed the battlefield, and because it attracted volunteers from across the Muslim world who would transform a local conflict into a global movement. The game changer arrived in 1986, the Stinger missile. The Stinger was a shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile capable of destroying helicopters and low-flying aircraft. Soviet air superiority had been devastating. Helicopter gunships could attack Mujahideen positions with impunity. But the Stinger negated that advantage. Soviet helicopter losses mounted. Pilots flew higher, reducing their effectiveness. The tactical balance shifted. The weapon that had seemed too sophisticated for guerrilla fighters proved devastatingly effective in their hands. The Stinger decision was controversial. Some officials worried about sophisticated weapons falling into hostile hands. They were overruled. Short-term military effectiveness trumped long-term proliferation concerns. When the war ended, the CIA attempted to buy back the Stingers. The buyback program recovered only a fraction. Hundreds of missiles remained unaccounted for, available to whoever possessed them. The Mujahideen were fighting jihad, holy war, against infidel invaders. This was not incidental to the conflict. It was its defining feature. American policymakers understood this and chose to promote it. Jihadist ideology was useful. It motivated fighters, attracted recruits, justified sacrifice. That the ideology was fundamentally hostile to Western values was a concern for another day. The promotion was not merely passive acceptance. The United States actively disseminated jihadist educational materials. The University of Nebraska, under contract with USAID, produced textbooks for Afghan children. These textbooks taught counting with illustrations of guns and tanks and knives. They taught reading with passages celebrating jihad against infidels. A generation of Afghan children learned that violence against unbelievers was righteous in textbooks printed by the United States government. The ideology spread beyond Afghanistan. Young men across the Muslim world heard the call to join the jihad. They came to fight the Soviets. They absorbed a worldview that identified enemies beyond USSR. Between 20,000 and 35,000 Arab volunteers traveled to Afghanistan during the 1980s. They came from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Yemen, Algeria, Libya, and beyond. These Afghan Arabs were recruited through religious networks funded largely by Gulf money. Saudi-funded mosques promoted the jihad as religious obligation. Charismatic preachers described the struggle as incumbent on every Muslim. Pakistan served as the gateway. The volunteers arrived in Peshawar, the Pakistani city near the Afghan border that became the hub of the jihad. They were processed, trained, and dispatched to various Mujahideen factions. They came to fight the Soviets. They learned something larger. They learned that jihad worked, that a superpower could be defeated by believers willing to sacrifice. They built networks that crossed national boundaries. They absorbed an ideology that identified enemies beyond the Soviet Union. They became a transnationalist movement. Among the volunteers was a young Saudi named Osama bin Laden, son of a construction billionaire with close ties to the royal family. Bin Laden arrived in Afghanistan in 1984, initially focused on logistics and fundraising. His family wealth and Saudi connections made him valuable. He could move money, purchase supplies, and recruit volunteers in ways others could not. He established the Maktab Akimat, the Services Bureau, which became the organizational infrastructure for the Arab Afghan movement. The Bureau recruited volunteers, arranged their travel, and supported them during their time in the jihad. The question of bin Laden's relationship with American intelligence has generated much controversy. The CIA denies any direct relationship, but the connection need not have been direct to have been real and effective. American money flowed through the Pakistani ISI and Saudi intelligence to the Mujahideen. The Services Bureau operated within networks funded by these sources. Bin Laden's operations benefited from the infrastructure that American money helped build, regardless of whether there was a direct connection or not. More importantly, American policy empowered bin Laden in ways that transcended finance. American promotion of jihadist ideology legitimized his worldview. American weapons gave the jihad military success. An American victory over the Soviets validated the belief that holy warriors could defeat superpowers. By the late 1980s, bin Laden had concluded that the jihad could not end with Soviet withdrawal. The struggle was global. The enemies of Islam included the United States and her allies. In August 1988, a small group met in Peshawar to establish al-Qaeda, the base. The founding documents, discovered years later, reveal the ambition. Al-Qaeda would maintain the networks built during the Afghan war. It would provide organizational structure for global operations. It would identify targets and plan attacks. The Mujahideen did not demobilize when the Soviets left. They globalized.
I warned against entangling alliances. They did not listen. Now you can trace exactly how it happened.
The Consequential Actions podcast is on YouTube. Subscribe and follow each series from the very beginning.
Principled debate requires participation. Like the episodes. Leave a comment. Join the discussion.
Every series is organized as a playlist, from General Welfare to The New Leviathan to Empire of Liberty. Begin at the beginning.
The Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan in February 1989. American policymakers celebrated. The Cold War was ending in American victory. Then America forgot about Afghanistan. Once the Soviets departed, American interest evaporated. Aid dropped precipitously. The billions that had flowed during the war became a trickle. There was no plan for post-war reconstruction, no effort to build institutions, no program to reintegrate the fighters who had been armed and trained. The Stinger missiles were left in the field. The CIA's buyback program was underfunded and ineffective. Charlie Wilson, who had built the operation, reportedly tried to secure funding for Afghan schools and reconstruction. He was refused. The war was over. Afghanistan was no longer a priority. In the movie Charlie Wilson's War, Tom Hanks, who plays Charlie Wilson, lamented, "These things happened. They were glorious, and they changed the world. And then we effed up the endgame." The choice of colorful language was purposeful. The endgame was not merely messed up. It was abandoned entirely. With the enemy gone, the Mujahideen factions turned on each other. The civil war that followed killed hundreds of thousands more Afghans. Kabul, which had survived the Soviet war relatively intact, was devastated by factional fighting. Different Mujahideen groups armed with American weapons battled for control. The city was reduced to rubble. Afghanistan became a failed state. And into that vacuum came the Taliban. The Taliban emerged from the Pakistani madrasas, religious schools that had educated Afghan refugees. Many Taliban fighters were Mujahideen veterans. They had learned to fight with American weapons, and now they would impose their vision of Islamic order. The movement promised to restore order after the chaos of civil war. For Afghans exhausted by years of violence, the promise had appeal, even if that order came with severe restrictions. Pakistani's ISI supported the Taliban as a client force. The same intelligence service that had distributed American weapons during the war now backed the movement that would host America's enemies. The Taliban swept through Afghanistan between 1994 and 1996. And in September of 1996, they took Kabul. Their first act was to seize former President Najibullah from the United Nations compound where he had sheltered for years. They tortured him, castrated him, and hung him from a traffic post. They imposed an extreme interpretation of Islamic law. Girls prohibited from school, women confined to their homes, public executions and amputations, music and television banned. The great Buddha statues at Bamiyan, carved into cliffs 15 centuries earlier, destroyed as idolatrous. The United States watched from a distance. There was no policy, no meaningful engagement, no apparent concern about what Afghanistan had become. The country that had been so important during the Cold War was now irrelevant. The Taliban provided sanctuary to al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden had spent years in Sudan after leaving Afghanistan. and expelled under American pressure in 1996, he returned to Afghanistan. The Taliban welcomed him. Training camps operated openly. Al-Qaeda's leadership planned operations from Afghan territory. The base for global jihad was established. In a country America had armed, abandoned, and ignored. The threat was not secret. The attacks that preceded September 11th made the danger explicit. In 1993, a truck bomb exploded beneath the World Trade Center. 6 people died. The bombers intended to topple one tower into the other, killing tens of thousands. They failed only because they miscalculated the explosive placement. The attack was organized by Ramzi Youssef, who had trained in Afghan camps. The networks were connected to the Afghan Arab movement. In 1998, al-Qaeda bombed American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania simultaneously. Over 200 people died. Bin Laden explicitly claimed responsibility. He declared war on the United States. President Clinton ordered cruise missiles to strike al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan. The strikes accomplished little. Bin Laden survived, and his prestige increased. He had faced down the American superpower. In 2000, al-Qaeda attacked the USS Cole in Yemen. 17 American sailors died. The pattern was unmistakable. Al-Qaeda was attacking American targets with increasing ambition and sophistication. The group operated from Afghan sanctuary. Its leader had declared his intentions openly and repeatedly. The threat was known. The response was inadequate. On a clear Tuesday morning, 19 hijackers turned 4 commercial aircraft into weapons. The September 11th attacks did not emerge from nothing. They were the culmination of a process that had begun in anti-Soviet jihad. The hijackers were recruited through networks that trace back to the Afghan war. The plot's mastermind had conceived operations years earlier. The money flowed through channels built to support the Mujahideen. The hijackers trained in al-Qaeda camps in Afghanistan, camps that operated because the Taliban provided sanctuary, staffed by veterans of the anti-Soviet war, using techniques developed by the jihad America had supported. The ideology that motivated them was the jihadist worldview that had crystallized during the Afghan war. The sanctuary they used existed because America had abandoned Afghanistan after using it. The chain of causation runs directly from the anti-Soviet jihad to the burning towers. This is not speculation. It is documented in the 9/11 Commission report, in court testimony and captured documents, in the statements of the perpetrators themselves. Blowback. Blowback is a term the CIA invented to describe the unintended consequences of covert operations. Consequences that blow back on the country that conducted them. Chalmers Johnson warned that American interventions were generating hostility that would manifest in attacks on American targets. He was ignored, then he was proven right. Afghanistan was the paradigm case. Armed fighters who became its enemies. America promoted an ideology that was turned against it. America created the conditions for the attack that transformed American society. Scott Horton, whose work documents these connections exhaustively, summarizes: the United States government intervention in Afghanistan in the 1980s helped to create the very forces that attacked America on September 11, 2001. The interventionist response is predictable. The Soviet Union was an existential threat. Defeating it was paramount. The Afghan operation contributed to that defeat any operation can have unintended consequences. That does not mean we should not act. These arguments contain truth but miss the essential point. The Soviet Union was collapsing from internal contradictions. The Cold War was ending regardless. Afghanistan accelerated the process, but it did not determine it. And more importantly, blowback was not unforeseeable. It was foreseen. Warning voices existed throughout the 1980s. Critics pointed out that arming religious extremists was dangerous, that jihadist ideology would not remain contained, that abandoning Afghanistan would create a vacuum. Those critics were dismissed as naive or soft on communism. Brzezinski's 1998 comments reveal the mindset. Even after the embassy bombings, even as al-Qaeda openly threatened America, he dismissed some agitated Muslims as insignificant compared to Cold War victory. Now, of course, we cannot prove a counterfactual. We cannot travel back in time and try alternate histories. But if we could, the evidence strongly suggests that even if the Soviets had been successful in propping up the communists in Afghanistan, what would have happened after is a similar eventual economic collapse and failure, as that ideology was always flawed. Even without American intervention in Afghanistan, communism would have failed the country and still brought about the collapse of the Soviets. However, it would have done so without American arms flowing into religious jihadists, without fostering a movement of extremism, without creating and paying for textbooks, teaching school children to count using weapons of war and death. While this is hindsight, it was not unpredictable. There were voices who clearly could see the potential for disaster and, more importantly, the immorality in the moment. There were warnings. They were ignored. Let's look at the arc of consequences. 1979, Soviet invasion, American covert response begins. 1989, Soviet withdrawal, America abandons Afghanistan. 1996, Taliban take over, al-Qaeda sanctuary established. 2001, the September 11th attacks, America invades Afghanistan. 2021, American withdrawal, Taliban returns to power. The wheel has turned full circle. The war that began in 1979 has never truly ended. The country that America used as a Cold War battlefield, abandoned, invaded, occupied for 20 years, and abandoned again, remains in the hands of the forces America once armed. The cost defies calculation. Afghan dead since 1979, over 1 million, perhaps 2 million. American dead on September 11th, 2,977. American dead in the Afghan war that followed, 2,461. American dead on the broader war on terror, thousands more. Trillions of dollars spent on wars that achieved no lasting outcome. Constitutional freedoms curtailed in the name of security, surveillance expanded, due process weakened, executive power enlarged. These costs were documented in our previous series, The New Leviathan. And the Taliban rules Afghanistan again. What should Afghanistan have taught? That covert operations have consequences beyond their immediate objectives. The Mujahideen did not disappear when the Soviets left. That the enemy of my enemy is not my friend. Shared enemies do not create shared values. That arming extremists does not produce moderates. Jihadism funded is jihadism strengthened. that abandoning countries after using them creates vacuums that enemies fill, and that ideology matters. You cannot promote holy war and expect it to remain contained. Were these lessons learned? After September 11th, the United States invaded Afghanistan and then repeated many of the same mistakes. 20 years of occupation, trillions of dollars, thousands of lives, and the Taliban returned to power. And we left some estimated hundreds of millions in military equipment behind, as well as a top flight Air Force base that we just abandoned. By some estimates, making that year the Taliban the third most well-funded army in the world. In Syria, the United States supported moderate rebels against the Assad government, rebels who included jihadist elements, rebels whose weapons found their way to extremists, rebels who resembled the Mujahideen in very uncomfortable ways. In Libya, American intervention helped overthrow Gaddafi and produce chaos that persists to this day. Libya now operates as a failed state with open-air slave markets. Syria's president is a former al-Qaeda general, a bin Ladenite. The institutional capacity for such operations remains. The assumptions that produced the Afghan disaster persist. The same think tanks, the same consultants, the same foreign policy establishment that was wrong about Afghanistan continues to shape American policy. Without accountability, the pattern will repeat. Was any of this necessary? Could the Cold War have been won without arming jihadists? Almost certainly, yes. The Soviet Union was collapsing under its own weight. Communism was not viable. We know that now. We knew that then. Could September 11th have been prevented with different policies? And maybe we can't know with certainty. But we know that the policies pursued contributed to the attack. Brzezinski asked, what is more important in world history, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? The question assumes we had to choose, that arming jihadists was necessary to defeat the Soviets. It was not. The question dismisses Afghan suffering as irrelevant. For Afghans, the choice was decades of war, millions dead, and a country destroyed. The question ignores American casualties. For the families of September 11th victims, the choice was their loved ones. The founders warned against foreign entanglements because they understood that such entanglements corrupt republics and generate endless conflict. Afghanistan proves them right. Charlie Wilson's war was celebrated as victory. The 2007 film treats it as a feel-good story of American pluck defeating an evil empire. But the movie ends before the consequences begin. The blowback from that war transformed American society. It cost thousands of American lives. It produced a surveillance state that the founders would not recognize. It justified 2 decades of war that achieved nothing permanent. The movie ended before the consequences began. But the consequences have not ended. They continue still. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been episode 12 of Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements, from the founders to the forever wars, on the Consequential Actions podcast. On Sunday, Article 13 examined September 11th and the American response. How a day of terror became justification for endless war. how emergency powers became permanent powers, and how the war on terror became a war without end. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com, where you'll find all the written articles as well as our previous articles on the General Welfare Clause and the New Leviathan. And subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes. And follow me on X at jkellick for updates, discussions, and announcements. Until then, have a great day.